So I'm probably not going to use the mic too much on this. A little bit of background. Most people kind of know who I am here, but I am the farm manager at Shaker Village, Pleasant Hill. I have been working there for the past 10 years in diversified agriculture. And over those 10 years, we eventually get into solar farming, or kind of like a landscaping of sorts. Before we do that, we'd like to give a little bit of history of who we are. So the Shakers, Shaker Village of Pleasant Hill represents the Shakers who first come here to America in 1774. Most people aren't associated with them, but they have large impacts. This is a religious communal society. They are famous for architecture, seeds, furniture, flat brooms, innovative agricultural approaches, and they created villages from Maine all the way down to Florida. One of the more unique things that people don't realize is, for instance, if you go, you garden, you get a package of seeds. Well, the Shakers are the first to ever put seeds in a paper envelope. So they have a huge influence on our agricultural history still today. So Pleasant Hill, this is outside of Lexington. This was an active village from 1805 to 1910, which occupied about 5,000 acres. That was including 260 structures. And the most unique thing is they're a closed loop society. So their main expenditures were glass and steel, salt and sugar. Everything they were able to do on this 5,000 acre farm was readily available. And these folks were actually your premier agriculturalists at the time. So people like Henry Clay partnered with the Shakers because of their expertise in agriculture. And that gets me to the point that they actually brought the first high quality animals into the state of Kentucky. Most people at that point in time that had cattle were just happy to have cattle. The Shakers, that wasn't enough. Quality over quantity. Now we've changed a lot from 1805 to 1910, but this is what our site looks like today. We have 3,000 original acres and then historic buildings and structures located around that property, including the farm. The main farm is up here. This is where our gardens are, some of our animal paddocks, and then we have lots of pastures that wrap the historic centers. So the farm really is immersed around the entire property. So as I said, 3,000 original acres, only 34 original buildings left on our property. We have a restored native habitat that occupies about 1,200 acres of our property, and then we have 120 acres of diversified farm operations. So our model really is farm to table. We have an on-site restaurant, so everything that we do provides for that restaurant, but we are getting into more of a direct-to-consumer model. We are certified organic in our gardens, our orchards, and we have well over 300 plus animals on our farm. And then in 2020, we get into solar grazing services, and we'll talk about how does that fit from a historical standpoint of what the Shakers were doing, but how it fits today for our operation. And this kind of gets us to our most important aspect. Every animal has a purpose. We do not think that food is the purpose of an animal. We think it's a luxury. They are our primary workforce. Even though we have a farm team, our team is pretty small. So when we employ 300 animals on our farm, well, we have a huge workforce that can do what we need them to do. We put the pieces in place, and that's because they mimic nature. Their behaviors mimic nature, and through that use of their skills, well, that reduces our dependence on fossil fuels. We're not bush hogging. We're not doing a lot of that work that would otherwise be provided through mechanical means. And as they reduce that fossil fuel, well, they're also providing our ecological services by converting biomass into nutrients, into energy, increasing our soil fertility, and most importantly, sequestering carbon. They become a major carbon sink for us, and this is our buddy Alamo. This is one of this is our longhorn here. is a 10-foot spread. He's a pretty impressive animal because we are a public site, so we want to make sure that when the public come, not only are we practicing things that can be taught and brought home, we want to have unique species that we can promote and support here on our farm. This is another prime example. So we raise pastured hogs, we do multi-species grazing. We've got some of the sheep that don't make it to the solar farm here, cattle back here in these pastures, and really they become the land management tool for us. But to kind of get the crux of what we're talking about today, well, we're going to be talking about solar agrivoltaics, which is a fancy term for the combination of solar and agriculture. And I think this is an integral part of what we've really got to drive down as solar comes into our state. And this is a perfect example of how that solar habitat has been integrated into the solar farm that we're managing. But before we talk about why agrivoltaics and solar, how this is important, well, we need to talk about what's happening. So we're talking about 3,331 megawatts of solar being proposed over the next 5 years. That's a lot. That requires, on average, 5 to 10 acres per megawatt. People don't realize that. And if we just split that 5 to 10 in the middle at 7.5, well, that's 25,000 acres of proposed land. It's a significant chunk of land. The argument is, well, prime agricultural land equals prime location for utility scale solar. So we're seeing this happen on a lot of our farmland, taking it out of production per se, but not every farm that has 1,000 acres is going to match the needs of a developer. The most important thing is transmission access. So a 1,000 acre farm in the middle of nowhere is not going to do a developer any good. Most of these we're going to see along major highways, major fairways where the transmission access is already there. But there is landowner benefits. A lot of people kind of go up in arms with the landowner, but these folks can range anywhere from $400 to $1,200 per acre for the perpetuity of the lease, which tends to be 25 to 30 years. So if you're at the top end, you're $1,000, $1,200 on 1,000 acres, that's a significant amount of change, and that keeps that farm and that family for generations. So there are some benefits to the landowner, and this is where we're coming into play, and I think this is the most important part for sustainable production is how we can be a part of this. So we can do this through grazing services. This doesn't have to be necessarily just sheep. That can be hogs, that can be chickens. This can be perennial, annual production within the alleys. This can be beekeeping, even row crops and hay to a degree, depending on how the site is developed. So when I see this, I see that the demand for land is high, the opportunity for dual use and sustainable solutions to match that is even higher. So when we were first approached for this project, well, we wanted to look at it as a regenerative project. How can we take this degraded land that's been cropped, that has been mined for its topsoil or its clay, and regenerate it? Well, here's what's not. Running a lawnmower to manage the 50-acre site, well, running that lawnmower for an hour is equivalent to about 45 miles traveled in a vehicle. People don't realize this. Even more, 3/4 of the work at a solar farm is done by weed eating. Having a crew out there doing that work, well, running that 2-stroke mower for an hour is equivalent to 3,900 miles traveled in a Ford Raptor. That's a lot of emissions coming out of that tiny little mower. Or there's, for instance, if you're going on 64 towards, towards Ashland, there's one that's completely gravel, doing nothing for biodiversity. And how they manage that? Well, they spray herbicides on that gravel. So it's not providing anything. Well, what is? Well, these can be converted into long-term grazing systems on what is normally highly cropped lands. So they're degraded to begin with. So you're increasing that soil fertility over that time. You can have crucial habitat for declining pollination or pollinators, and these can be developed in highly diverse systems. As you do that, well, you're reducing that fossil fuel use that is going into managing the sites. And I think the ultimate goal is to become carbon farmers at these sites, making these net negative solar sites, and eventually, even banking into carbon credits. So when we look at this, when we look at the Shaker story, well, a lot of times progression is regression, going back to what we used to do really well. And that's how we took on this project, is looking at the past as a way to influence our choices today. And solar mimics natural systems. We're already solar farmers, because as the sun converts any of our plants into energy that is turned into biomass, well, essentially it's doing the exact same thing to turn energy to power our homes. That reduces the fossil fuel emissions and reliance on us, on the utility company, and that's providing ecological services by tying that land up into intensive production and reintroducing plant diversity, all tracing back to that every animal has a purpose, that philosophy that we discussed earlier. So this is how we began the project. We began this in the height of the pandemic. It was a really weird time for us because we went from 160 employees at Shaker Village down to 12. So we did this in partnership with LG&E and KU, but this was also part of a larger research project with the Electric Power and Research Institute out of DC. Their goals is to make the utility sector more sustainable, and this was one of their pilots into the solar industry. So they wanted to look at it from an entomology, from a native habitat perspective, integrating sheep, but also the cost effectiveness of this. And at the time, this was Kentucky's largest solar farm at 50 acres. 35 acres of that site was in panels, and that's about 44,000 panels. This is small potatoes as to what's happening in the solar industry today. We're talking thousands of acres being proposed all over the state. So it's quite a bit of solar being proposed in the next 5 years. But solar grazing, when we first looked at this, well, it's an alternative solution to the conventional means that we're used to. The big thing that we wanted to be ahead of, and I think we need to be ahead of as producers, is, well, we want to keep that agricultural land in agriculture. We want to offer habitat opportunities for those declining populations, but for us, we definitely want to make sure that the small ruminant sector in the state continues to grow and expand this. So for instance, if we look at that 25,000 acres, well, Kentucky has about 58,000 sheep total. Well, if we were to scale up to match the need of the land that's going to be occupied, we're looking at an increase of 250,000 sheep that could be supportive on those solar farms. So we can see what is a very small sector of our agriculture be expanded significantly over in 5 years' time to support this land management need. So for us, on 35 acres, through intensive methods, rotational grazing, we can have anywhere from 120 to 150 sheep on our property. Now, at heart, I'm a wool guy. My back is a hair sheep guy. So we have a combination of both. But the big thing for us, we are a nonprofit, and this was additional income for grazing services. If you're thinking of this and you're looking at this as an opportunity, you're not doing this for free. As long as you are $1 under a landscape crew, you're going to win that contract. You're going to keep that landscape crew out because essentially you're saving that utility money by doing them a service. So you're going to get paid for this, and it can be pretty lucrative, anywhere from $200 an acre on a large scale to even as much as $1,000 an acre of land management on a smaller scale. So there's a lot of money to be made, once again, adding to the security of your farm operation. So this is what the site looks like. This is, as I mentioned, 44,000 panels scattered throughout. The best thing for us, the way that we break up our farm, really mimics this as far as a grazing pattern goes. Now, why sheep? Well, these panels at their lowest end are only 36 inches tall. A man has a lot of trouble getting underneath of that. So it becomes, one, a safety and a labor hazard. So what we did when we first started adding in, well, we built 14 paddocks, anywhere from 1.5 to 3 acre sections. This bottom section here is unimproved. We wanted to see what the sheep could do on just Cool season, unimproved grasses, so those are clovers, bluegrass, vetch, some of those common things that you see in your normal pasture. And then the rest of this, all 25 acres, is planted in sheep-friendly native grasses. Everything around the solar farm is planted in native grasses as well. And then for a biosecurity standpoint and federal regulations, this whole site is fenced around in a 10-foot chain link fence. So essentially your sheep are safe. Very little things can get in there and become predator problems. The biggest thing as these sites are developed, and we were lucky enough, is water. The sheep have to have water, and if you don't try to promote water access as they develop these sites, and they'll run it for you, you're going to have trouble hauling water to the site. So we have water access, which is a huge, huge perk for us. And one of the things you can't see in this picture, up here, it's a coal ash pond. They're no longer using that. So what they did, and I think one of my favorite things, also a bad thing, is they removed every inch of soil to get to the clay to cap that pond off. So everything that I do from here on out is an improvement, and it's an improvement that can be seen over time. So it's an opportunity to really increase what we've done. So if I'm competing with a landscape crew, well, we need to make sure that infrastructure matches the demand of the solar site. So once that landscape crew would come in, mow, weed eat, once they're out, you don't know they're there. So I need to be able to do those exact same things. Well, if you're already rotationally grazing at your farm, doing multi-species stuff, you're using a lot of the same materials that you would use at this solar farm. You're using polywire, something that's non-obstructive. Every paddock can be moved. It's semi-permanent. We use just a solar energizer charger. Puts out about 8 kilovolts. But the line management really becomes the most labor-intensive aspect of this project. It's pretty seamless, other than making sure that your line's not getting ground out by vegetation. And our grazing season, well, this takes pressure off of our own farm. So it begins in April, March, April, and as long as the season's working right, well, we can graze anywhere from November to December. So essentially, we're resting our farm 3/4 of the year, while the rest of the season, they're grazing somewhere else. And then we focus on high-density rotations. So that's based on, one, forage availability, our labor output, but it's usually about twice a week. And we really gun for about 45 days of recovery period before those sheep ever step back onto any given paddock. You know, that depends on your personal preference, what you can do in seasonality. Initially, we were doing 60 days rest, but we'll talk a little bit about why 60 days doesn't necessarily work. But this is the paddock design. This is how we started. Paddock 1 is where the sheep begin every season. This is 1.5 acres. This whole thing here is 3 acres, split in 2. Sheep graze, they move on, they keep this process up till they make it up here to native 8. Once they make it to this corner, we walk them all the way down this concrete or a gravel path and start this all over again. Essentially, we're only grazing this site 2 to 3 times a year. We're making sure that we keep vegetation low so it doesn't impede, but we want to make sure that there's enough left behind for the sheep and for the care of the land, because this is actually gently sloping, and we want to make sure that we don't run into an erosion problem. So the grass is kind of being that protector on this sloping landscape. This is the best part. We weren't ready for this. We had like 5 sheep. So when they said, hey, you got sheep, could you do this? I immediately said yes, out of the excitement, but we didn't have the sheep to manage this site. So we had to scale up. And most people that right now have sheep in small ruminants, they're not scaled up to be able to match this. So this made us and give us a reason to begin bringing in more sheep. We initially started with Shetlands. I primarily like to stick with heritage breeds because I like the idea of you got to eat them to save them, you got to shave them to save them, and the Shetlands are one of those breeds. They're unimproved, they can eat rocks and grow. They're a very hardy breed. But we quickly realized, once again, we didn't have enough sheep. So we bought more, and we went with a hare breed. It's a cross that we got from a farm in Garrett County. And as we chose the Shetland, we kind of did it because we didn't know how well they would navigate. We didn't know if they would chew on wires, scratch on panels. Well, sheep tend to be pretty predictable. They weren't chewing on wires, they're not jumping. And over the past 4 years, well, we noticed that breed selection is probably not as big of a deal as you would expect. And we are now approaching over 300 ewes because of this project, which means a pretty significant lamb crop this year. So I think this is one of the biggest things happening at our solar farm. There's currently natives in solar operations. There's currently sheep. This is the first combination of both, of a dual purpose project. And we worked with Roundstone Native Seed, which is a company here in the state. And we started with 11 types of native grasses, 24 types of native forbs, and 7 types of annuals that really act as a nursery crop as this native habitat got established. It took a couple years, but this is what it looks like in the peak of the summer. Lots of diversity. And these are some of the things that you're going to find within this. There's lots of coneflowers, there's echinaceas, there's coreopsises, mints. We've got some cytodes gamma. So a lot of these are actually pretty palatable to the sheep's diet. As we'll get into it, some of these things may not make sense. Mints. Sheep don't eat mint. They won't touch it. If you know anything about mint and you grow mint, well, what does it do? Well, if it has no competition, it spreads. So you would be careful about adding in some of these things. Butterfly milkweed. Well, everyone says sheep won't eat it. It's toxic. Sheep will eat it. So so far, so good. No problems. So I think some of the things when we're looking at this is how does the behavior of the sheep interact at a place like this? Well, it's quiet. So most people think of a power plant, coal-powered, it's loud, it's obnoxious. These solar panels, this particular site is equivalent to about 100,000 toasters going at one time. So you would never know it when you walked on. It's silent. Sheep like the shade. So essentially, we've all been talking about silvopastures, all those types of things. Well, you've got 35 acres of silvopasture. You've got shade, you've got alleys. And the sheep spend most of their time under those panels, and we'll talk about a little bit how that helps the developer or the utility by their time spent under those panels, because there are some risks to solar. And then I like to watch the behavior of what our sheep are doing. If sheep feel threatened, well, they stay together. If sheep feel comfortable, they spread out when they feel safe. So if you go to the solar farm, they're not all in one dense pocket. They're spread out during rumination. And then 2 wires. If you've ever raised sheep, you know keeping sheep in can be very difficult. But a full and happy sheep is a sheep that's happy where they are. So we've had no escapes, very little to no issues with predation, even though we do keep guard dogs there. If a coyote gets in, he's just as trapped in that 10-foot chain link fence as everybody else in there. So we don't want him having a field day. And the biggest thing, once again, we want the utility to barely know that we're there. So we don't interfere with their day-to-day maintenance. That polywire design, if they need to get in quick, they can drop that line and do what they need to do. And they can put that line up quick. So we want to make sure as we're there that we don't become a problem, because as I mentioned earlier, that landscape crew, when they come in, they're gone. So we want to make it as easy for the utility as possible. So we're a working relationship with them. There are certain things that they may ask you to do. Inverters take direct current, turn it into AC alternate current, so we can use it at home. So we keep sheep off of that. That's high electricity, we be careful. The recovery periods of 45 days, pretty good regrowth. Anything longer could be problems, especially when we get into summer and there's little interference with any wiring. We watch sheep scratch their backs on it and we all kind of cringe because we're like, please don't get shocked, but we've never had those issues. And then as we've gotten better at this over the years, our management of fencing has significantly dropped. And we'll talk about some of the ways that we've done that in pictures and by maybe extending our rotation. This is my favorite part. Putting up fence is One is time consuming. Rolling up fence is even more time consuming. It's like you're fishing for days on end, because this is thousands and thousands of feet of electric line going up. So our successes. Once again, I'm competing with a landscape crew, so I need to be as competitive with them as possible. So we're actually able to maintain really good stands of grass that, as we'll see in some of the pictures, that looks as good as a lawnmower. And then we get, 8 to 10 inches in the spring, but nothing that's ever going to keep solar panels from being doing what they do well. And then summer adds a little more challenge because of things like Johnson grass. If you've ever been around Johnson grass, it can get 5-6 feet pretty easy, and that could actually shade the panels and become a little bit of risk. So a little more variation, but still no problems. The fall, well, they're our cleanup crew. Anything that's left behind, we leave them in there a little bit longer, clean it up. We just want to make sure that we leave enough ground cover for the winter months to kind of protect that ground going into the harsh seasons. So this is where we're at. This is spring. This is day 1, 2020. This is 25 sheep placed in here. 5 days later, we have this. Now, one of the reasons that we kind of leave them in here a little bit longer, as I mentioned, we have to weed eat this line that's going all through here. Once again, it's thousands of feet of line. We've already talked about how a two-cycle motors, super inefficient use of fuel. So by extending days, if day 4 we're like, okay, we're almost out of grass, let's leave them a few more hours. What are they going to do? They're going to want to try to get to the other side. They're going to eat a little closer to that line. So they essentially become our weed eater. And you can see what they're moving into next, real dense. You can also see under these panels as we go through some of these pictures how well they manage the grass under the panels themselves. This is 45 days later. So now we've got this hairy vetch growing up, 18, 20 inches tall. We've got lots of clover. You can see the dandelions here, lots of plant diversity. And there's some buttercup here too. As I mentioned, this is degraded soil. I like to say every weed tells you a story. Buttercup's saying this has been overgrazed, this has either been poorly managed. Well, what we do in the spring now, instead of March, sometimes we wait until May. Buttercup doesn't like competition, so the more that we let the grass grow up, well, the less the buttercup will thrive. So we try to manage some of our problem issues, not through spraying, but through growth alone. This is summer, so we start seeing some of these other variations of height. We've got some broom sedge here. You can see we've got Johnson grass. We've got a little mulberry tree here growing. Once again, 5 days later, completely different picture. They're able to maintain all of this vegetation, meanwhile, maintaining their own body weight and condition all through the same process. It's 45 days later. This is where we start to get a little bit of a problem. Johnson grass, as I mentioned, well, it spreads through seeds, it spreads through rhizomes. This is not what you want happening at a solar farm. Even though from a grazer standpoint, this is a great summer annual. Sheep love it. It's great nutrition, but as it becomes taller, well, it becomes less palatable, and it's a less chance that they're going to eat this at all. So we need to keep this in a growth state at all times, and that's our main goal in the summer, to make sure that we keep this forage good, palatable, and nutritious for the sheep. So we may actually speed up some of our rotations to make sure that we don't get too tall. Because as I mentioned, the first year we were trying to gun for some 60-day rest, while Johnson grass was choking out a lot of the good stuff below, but also then becomes unpalatable to the sheep. Here we are with the fall. Now they got their wool coat on. They shear them in the spring, and this becomes our cleanup crew. So this is what we're looking like coming into the winter. We come back in January, well, this is where we're at now. This is after a 45-day period. Now we've got good ground cover. Now, a lot of this is fescues. Essentially, this was all planted with no-mow grass, but it gets out-competed pretty quick by things like bluegrass and tall fescues. So the big thing, though, is how do sheep graze natives? What's their behavior in it? Well, I was actually a little shocked. Sheep actually favor much of this forage located within these established pollinator sections, probably a little too much. Natives are very expensive to establish. It takes years to do it, and sheep can outgraze it much quicker than it can establish. So grazing for habitat management is completely different than grazing for vegetation control. So grazing these sites really require an adaptive plan. This could be maybe reducing stock density. That could be pulling the sheep off the solar farm completely to allow those natives to do what they do best, and then bringing them in the fall to clean it up, or maybe moving them faster. Natives don't like a lot of competition, so what we can be as a habitat management access is, before those natives come in, we can graze that site really hard, leave it down to the ground, so as natives come in, they're able to compete really well with the cool season stuff that was there previously. And there was a circumstance that we actually reduced our numbers through June, and then increased once again late July to kind of clean up that farm. There are some problems. We did have some poor body condition when we first started grazing natives, and there's a few reasons why. Well, natives don't offer a lot of nutritional value. They have lots of fiber, so essentially what the sheep are doing is they're consuming this at a faster rate, trying to gain that same amount as energy as they would from cool season grasses. So cool season grasses, which sheep's diets are adapted to, well, they have less fiber, a lot more nutrients, where the native vegetation has a lot more fiber and a lot less nutrients. So it took me a while to kind of figure that out, but I had a professor from Indiana came down and I was like, there's plenty here. They're eating it. It's green. What's happening? And he kind of broke that down for me, and that makes a lot more sense. So you really have to watch what's happening in the summer. But this is grazing after 3 days in the late fall. This is where we're at. We still have some of these cone flowers here. Well, 3 days later, they've cleaned all this up. And some really neat things are happening here that you don't actually realize. As the wool, the hair on the sheep, well, what they're doing is they're catching these seeds. It's getting caught in their wool. They're knocking them off of the plant. They're essentially reseeding this free every season as they graze these. So they are able to take this, turn it into a little bit of energy, take all those seeds and replace them into this ground. So year after year that they continue this, we'll maintain really good stands. And then you can see here underneath this panel where they spend all of their time, they're essentially keeping this safe from a fire risk. All of these little lines are hot, so you have to be careful. If this were to catch fire, and they have, as we've been at this grazing site, well, if this is all dry, this becomes a huge fire hazard. The one section that caught fire, we had just grazed, and it would have been a major problem if the sheep would not have been there. So the sheep actually saved from a major fire outbreak here at the solar farm. Now, this is what we did this season for habitat management. There's about 120 sheep in this section right here. Well, this is 2 days. We get that first good flush. Most of the things have bloomed. There's a lot of partridge pea in there. So what we're doing now is we're essentially using the sheep to try to get a second flush. So we don't graze it near as hard. They clear out everything underneath. They go for the cool season stuff first, and then we allow them to kind of knock back these natives a little bit and then move them on. So that's the difference between vegetation and habitat management, is we're making an adaptive plan that can ensure that this site continues to be suitable for pollinators, but provide habitat for the 120 sheep that are also occupying it. So as we talked, there are some concerns. Once again, you're competing with a lawnmower, so you have to watch these invasive species, this Johnson grass. You have to be careful as when you're grazing it because of the toxicity that comes within it, and keeping that really in a growth state. There's also certain things like broom sedge. This, as I mentioned, this is mined soil, so poor fertility. Broom sedge tells me once again a story that there's not much fertility there. Also, the sheep don't like it, so they're not going to eat it much. But as we continue to do what we're doing, increase the quality of that soil, well, broom sedge doesn't like high fertility. So essentially, we can remove that broom sedge through time and increase in soil quality. So there are certain circumstances, though, as you take on these sites, you become the sole monitor. You may have to actually go in there and manually weed eat some of these problem areas if the solar farm asks you to do it. And then Kentucky really is not a grassland. Where central Kentucky in general is a forest. So you're always having the problem with succession. Things like honeysuckle is a problem around here, woody stem plants, blackberries. These are things that sheep can manage, once again, if you keep them in growth. But if it gets ahead of you, well, essentially you're going to have to go in there because you've taken all sole vegetation management. You may have to go in there and actually cut those out yourself. But the sheep will maintain it for you, keep it in a growth state, and really letting it from getting out of control. And that's because we're may have to adjust to make this happen. And then as far as native pollinator habitat, which I think is essentially where a lot of these sites are wanting to go, you have to really define what your goal is, what the solar developer's goal is are you all managing for that habitat or vegetation control? Because these sites don't know the difference. What they see is they want something to kind of be prim and proper. Well, native is not prim and proper. It's got lots of layers, lots of different plant populations. So you really have to establish with them, like, what is it that you want out of this habitat? And then, as I mentioned, that mountain mint. It's definitely taken over in certain sections. And now, as we've worked with LG&E and KU, as they install more of these pollinator habitats, we're not going to put the mint into the main solar farm. Maybe on the outsides, as we had mentioned, that the total perimeter is occupied native grasses as well. So now we know what's not going to be good plants within that site. And then the sheep will actually graze these areas much more prolific. So every dollar that they invested could actually just be eaten and not replenished. Now, here's the big thing. I think this is where this gives us a lot of opportunity from a grazing standpoint, but it's not limited to grazing. It's really one of those things of thinking outside of the box, which our industry is really good at, is getting outside of the box. And I see this as a land access issue. As I noticed in a lot of these conversations is, as a young farmer, you don't have access to land. Well, these developers want this, and a lot of communities want this. And without that agriculture connection, well, they're actually being fought tooth and nail not to come in within their communities. So if we can stay ahead of this, have that sustainable influence, this can also be access to land for individuals that have no access to land. You want to start with sheep. These 1,000-acre sites, you may not have to have a second farm like we do at Shaker Village. That site could become a consistent source of land and a full-time operation that sheep stay there year-round. Our main reason for bringing them home is this cute little thing right here. We don't want to chase that around panels or pull a lamb under a 36-inch panel. So we bring them home, we lamb where we know we can make sure that the lamb crop is being watched daily. But essentially, if you have the labor, the time, you could keep sheep at a solar farm year-round. And then it's not limited to just livestock. I've seen some really unique approaches to vegetable production, to flowers, to herbs, to perennial production within these sites. And there's one in Colorado called Jack's Solar Farm that is essentially a research hub as to how we can create productive systems, plant systems within these solar farms. And I do think that these solar farms can essentially be certified organic in time. LG&E and KU is not spraying anything. There's no chemicals there. So I think these solar farms can not only become access to land, access to unconventional means of management, but it could also eventually lead into further organic land management because these sites are going to be in production for the next 25 to 30 years. And I think us as a state, Kentucky was a sheep farming state. Most people don't realize that. It wasn't up until really the 1940s, 1950s that we become a really high cattle state. So this offers the opportunity for small ruminant grazers to kind of enter the foot into increasing the demand for lamb. And as we know, our population is constantly diverse. Lamb's a huge market in ethnic groups, and this is a crop that we can support the diversity coming into all of our communities. And the big thing I like to point out is the research opportunities. This is land locked up for 25, 30 years. This gives a long-term research to the validity of regenerative agriculture. It's going to stay in production. It's going to be producing solar energy for 25, 30 years. So there's lots of research opportunities from a habitat, from a production, from a land management standard that otherwise could be bought out and developed into houses. This isn't happening at a solar farm. So I like the idea that having land locked up for agriculture for 25, 30 years is a pretty unique thing, also while producing energy and giving lots of research opportunities for the validity of sustainable and regenerative agriculture. And this is kind of us in the late fall of our bloom here. This is one of my favorite sheep. He got out of the butcher block. So if you ever have any questions, we've been doing this. We were the first solar grazing operation in the state. This project has received lots of national awards. It's being adopted across utilities, across the state, across the nation. We've even have some worldwide visitations to see how we're doing this combination of native sheep, dual grazing purposes here. So we're always happy to talk about it. We're always happy to show people what we're doing, and then we do lots of tours on this year-round. So you're welcome to always come out to Shaker Village, and we can kind of show you what this looks like at scale. And I think really where the solar is essentially going here in the next 5 to 10 years. We've all been surprised by the production of grasses underneath of the solar panels. So this is a research and development project for LG&E and KU. So they're actually so LG&E and KU is essentially right now researching why there's grass happening under there, and you're getting so much growth. So they have temperature and humidity monitors underneath the panels to see what the microclimate's happening. Even in that drip line, one of the things that I was really surprised by is there's better grass underneath the panels in the shade than there is the alleys. And we think a lot of that has to do with the microclimate and some of the reflections that you get off of the solar panels in those alleys. So essentially, we have better grasses underneath those panels at times than we do underneath the alleys.
Is it kind of like a mix of cool season and
yeah. Yeah, so you kind of keep what's happening under the panels in a perpetual spring, perpetual fall. And you're also capturing moisture too, because the moisture is not escaping at the same rate in the summertime. So you're keeping that microclimate, maintaining a grass growth. Otherwise, it would be dried out in the summer months. So it's actually pretty unique to see that your grass is essentially kind of secure. Your cool season grasses are secure in times where other people's wouldn't be. Yeah.
Is there a runoff line at the bottom side of the panel?
There are in sections. So before this was grazed, you can see where a lot of the erosion was happening. Erosion has dropped dramatically now that we're having the sheep on it. And, EPRI's also an advanced technology company, the research. And there for a while, they were really trying to convince everybody that sheep wasn't the answer, that robots were. But that's my favorite part about all this, and speaking about those erosion lines and stuff like that. Robot sounds really good on a flat, perfect surface. But the first time they hit that rock, they hit that ditch line, they can't navigate it. Sheep can. So essentially, we can maintain those erosion lines by keeping the sheep in there and become a lot more efficient than a robot. Yeah, and that's the big thing with this is the best method for most solar farms is to make sure there's little to no grass. So they become a problem for runoff, erosion, by, once again, getting ahead of the curve, making sure that our influence, our sustainable influence is at these sites. We're eliminating those problems for them naturally because what the sheep can do for them, they can do as well, but it costs them lots of money. And as you as you know, if you're familiar, utilities like having fairly expensive bills but spending fairly little money. So this makes sure that we're the most competitive thing happening and the best solution for them. Yeah.
So did you help make the plans for how the paddocks were set up, or did they just set it up, the electrical company that came in and set it up?
So this is not something that we reinvented. We were already doing this at Shaker Village, and that was one of the things that really impressed the utility. It was two things. One, we're neighbors. We have to look at them, they look at us. We can see them, but essentially everything that we were doing at the village was just replicated. We designed all the paddocks. We knew what really worked well for our rotations, how we manage rotations from a labor standpoint, from an animal standpoint. So all I did was go over to the solar farm and completely replicate what we were doing at the actual farm at Shaker Village. So yeah, we designed this from ground up. Yep.
And where do you take all the 300 sheep in the winter?
They come back to our own farm.
Okay.
So right now,
I guess you would have enough pasture to do partly pasture and partly feeding?
yeah, so we're grass-fed based. The only time that we give sheep grain is the last gestation period. So other than that, and that's another reason why we bring them home, we make sure they have ample diet through that last period of gestation. So yeah, we bring them home. We've got 3,000 acres of untapped potential. So we don't really have a land access issue. And it just becomes comfort for me. You know, I want to see them every day before lambing to make sure if there's any problems. And most of my team sitting right here, they know we're constantly watching. We're on lamb watch now.
So you land in February?
It's late February, yeah. We want to get ahead of it, so we'll start lambing here in the next 3 weeks, and we'll lamb for about a 6-week period, and then it's done. It's a very stressful 6-week period.
Spring lambing rotation, you know, do spring and fall.
Yeah, we don't do spring and fall. A couple reasons why. We are a public site, so you can come visit us 365. And we always have something called Brunch with the Babies. We try to line up all of our new babies, our born animals in April to kind of highlight, one, the rebirth of spring, but the birth of all the new life coming. So we go ahead and get it out in the spring. The big reason why is because we have better grasses coming in for the nutrition versus if you do it in the fall, you have less nutrition, you're doing more supplementation for fall lambing. But if you do fall lambing, you have better access to the ethnic market that I was discussing earlier for Easter lambs and those types of things. So it's totally up to your preference.
And then do you market most of your lambs as meat, or are you also selling stock?
So we sold our first stock this week. I'm pretty territorial over our sheep. We've had a closed herd for a long time. So I've always had a hard time letting things go. But we did sell our first lambs, or our first breeding ewes outside of the village. My main goal and our goal at Shaker Village is we don't want the food miles in most food systems. Because we have a restaurant, because we put in the work, we want to ensure that our work is maintained. So everything that we raise mostly is either sold to people in our community or sold directly to our restaurant. So very few of the animals that are raised at Shaker Village leave Shaker Village unless it's on a plate. Yeah.
Well, that's a lot of lambs, though.
It's a lot of lambs, yeah. And that's where we're getting. We're trying to create that market, that direct-to-consumer market. And it's easily done in things like chicken and cattle and hogs. Lamb's still relatively new to our diet. So we're working on that market. But the big thing for us is, once again, they're tools. We'll make sure that we use them as a tool before we use them as a food source. And once they've occupied that tool for us, then we'll turn them in to something that provides for us. And then we're really setting up to scale. You know, there's 2,000-acre projects being proposed in Mercer County. And that's great for us as an operation because, once again, it extends our security as a farm. So we're trying to scale up to be able to support these coming solar projects and make sure that they stay in production. You know, I never thought I'd be passionate over sheep and solar. I never thought I would be into solar at all because I used to kind of, utilities and coal is one of the things that, you always kind of like shake your fist at. But it is unique to see that, and I've spoke to developers all over the United States, this is a very important focus for them. It's a very important aspect of their sustainability goals. So I was surprised how impressed and how happy everybody at, a Fortune 500 company actually is. And, the CEO of PPL actually knows what our project is. All the things that they have going on, he asked about the sheep, and I think that's pretty unique from a corporate scale to have that kind of influence. Yeah.
It appears that you do some holistic type grazing, although the rotation seems slower.
Yeah.
Was that part of your training that you get involved in training principles for grazing?
My mentor's still sitting in this room over there. So this guy, Dylan Kennedy over here, was one of the main trainers in trying to get into those holistic approaches. So we looked at animals as, once again, as a tool. So most of ours is under the holistic approaches. We do a little bit slower rotations because, once again, I'm competing with a landscape crew. So, yeah, we're definitely under the holistic management approach. Even though we're not labored to rotate every day, it's a lot of labor from our standpoint. We have 300 animals, we do tours, we've got gardens, orchards. So we set up a rotation that matches our labor demand, but also matches the land demand. And that's where some of our paddocks are a little bit bigger. If I was rotating every day, they'd be smaller paddocks, a lot more intensive. So we give them a little bit more space to give us, as a team, a little bit more time to do what we need to do. But yeah, definitely take the holistic approach. Yep.
So 25 to 30 years is what the leases usually are, and is that because that's like a lifetime?
Yeah.
Are there any sites that are old enough to know like what happens?
The decommission process?
Yeah.
There's a few, but there's not a ton. That's the big thing as to what's happening to the recycling of these panels. It's hard to say. We're 25, 30 years out from really knowing a lot of details on it. But most of the materials in it are recyclable. So I think the innovation will be there as we continue the demand because it's going to have to be in time. So if you're talking, this one site's 44,000 acre panels at 35 acres, talking lots of steel, lots of glass. So I think essentially it'll get to a point where it's really being recycled. And the technology is getting better. This is a really infant solar site. So Solar Share, which is off of Shelbyville, Shepherdsville, as you're going to Louisville, every time they lease a section of solar, you can actually see how much the technology has changed year to year. Those inverter boxes that I were talking about, they don't even exist anymore. The inverters are built into the solar panels. So you're seeing a huge jump in technology from section to section, year to year. So instead of it being 44,000 panels, years down the road, those panels will be a lot more efficient at capturing the same amount of energy in less amount of space.
I just want to interject that I have lived off grid for 25 years, and I have solar panels that I got used because back then solar was expensive.
Yeah.
And I got them used, and then in some places in the Caribbean, go through a storm, and they used for 20 years before that, and those panels were still on.
Yeah. So, yeah, they'll last a long time. And to say 25, 30 years, that's the average. They could last much longer. And I think as the technology develops, they'll last even longer. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about grazing it after, so say a farmer lease it done, and they actually do want to leave,
Yeah.
root and that stuff. But it sounds like a farmer might want to keep some of them out there even if they don't work, like based on what's happening with some of the foraging.
Yeah, I mean, you've essentially created an artificial forest. Yeah. That can be highly cropped. And I think from a commodity standpoint, row crop standpoint, by having a solar farm on maybe on row crop land, you've essentially extended the lifespan and production of that row crop land 25, 30 years. It's going to go 25, 30 years in the future that has potential. So if there's degraded all around you, well, all of a sudden you've got 2,000 acres of land that is being sustained for another 25, 30 years. Decommission is a very important part. It is in every contract. So after 25, 30 years, you don't want into the solar business. It's your land. You have every right to ask them to pull it off. And it's very clear that they are responsible for removing every pylon and returning the land back to how it was as to when they got it. Yeah, there's a lot of regulation to make sure that if you're a private landowner, KU owns this one, but if you're a private landowner, the decommission process, there's a lot of regulations to ensure that you're protected 25, 30 years down the road, that you don't have to remove the panels. Yeah.
Do you have a say on the configuration? Could it be a linear, less block, could be spread out?
You have a lot more say than you think. So as we've been talking to developers, they'll hand me a plan and they'll say, hey, this is kind of what we're thinking. What are you thinking? How would this work from an agricultural standpoint? What does this look from a grazing standpoint? They're actually giving you a lot more opportunity to have say-so in the development of it, because it is important, one, from a sustainability, but it's important from a community standpoint. So they see the value in giving us say-so in it. And I've just did a consultation, and they're looking for regenerative farmers specifically. Not just any farmer, they're looking for regenerative farmers. So they're seeking us out as producers specifically to do these types of projects. So they're giving us a lot more say-so than you would expect from a large-scale developer. Yeah.
It seems like they could use those right-of-ways where they spray, and create invasives to have a linear solar panel.
Yeah.
Along with their high wires.
Yeah, and I think the adaptability of the solar industry will change as, like I said, transmission access is going to be the huge aspect for them. You know, I've went to lots of zoning meetings, and when people hear solar's coming and they like, oh God, somebody down the road has 5,000 acres, it's all going into solar. He's nowhere near a transmission line. That's not going to happen. So those right-of-ways, those close accesses to highways, that's where most of the development is going to occur. So once that land's swooped up, well, then essentially they would still do those straight linear paths that you're discussing. So I think eventually the technology could be adapted into that. Yeah. So it'd be neat to see where it goes.
Do you hear much about goats being used, or is that deeply disposed?
Well, goats could be used, but you've got to make sure your wires are completely protected, because if you know anything about a goat, is that wire is going to look pretty tasty. Not necessarily taller, but it would need to be protected in the right conduit. And the panels would have to be up a little bit higher to make sure that they couldn't jump on it. Yeah. I don't know of anybody doing it. I think it's essentially the risk of what the goats like to do. And that's where sheep have been prioritized. There are people using cattle, but you're never going to convince a developer to install pylons tall enough. That's a lot of steel to allow cattle to be able to, not at a utility scale at least. So goats are an opportunity, but it'll take a lot of protection of the wires themselves. Yeah. I think the biggest one's chickens, hogs, poultry. You know, those are all super integrated that could fit right through the alleys, essentially doing the exact same thing. And that's what I meant with the highly diverse systems is it doesn't have to be just sheep. Be sheep, followed by chickens, followed by hogs. You know, it can really become a very diverse operation. It's not just your farm, you know. It can far extend what you're doing. Yep. Awesome. Yeah, thanks. It's been fun.